Welcome to the Lifestyle First podcast, discussing lifestyle medicine and making self-care as easy as 1, 2, 3. 1 question, 2 research reviews, and 3 actionable health tips, all centered around the Lifestyle First method, your blueprint for the 10 key routes of optimal health and happiness. And now your host, lifestyle medicine physician and coach, Dr. Alka Patel.
Hi, hey, and hello. Welcome to Series 8, Episode 7. Now, the theme that we're focusing on today is why for your connections. And there's one question that we're exploring, and that is, what makes marriage work? Now, to help answer that question, I'm delighted to welcome my guest today, who is Dr. Alexandra Stockwell, also known as the Intimacy Doctor. And she's the author of the book, Uncompromising Intimacy: Turn Your Unfulfilling Marriage into a Deeply Satisfying, Passionate Partnership. And she also hosts her own podcast, the Marriage Podcast. So, Alexandra, welcome. It's really good to be having this conversation with you.
I'm so grateful to be here. And I just love how you have honed in on what in my world is the most important question.
For sure. Absolutely. So look, let's just get right into the heart of it. Marriage, right? It's not easy. It's devotion and it's dedication, passion, love, intimacy, connection, sustenance, commitment, fulfillment, fun, so many words, so many intricate elements. So why is it that marriage then is not working as this deeply satisfying, passionate partnership that you describe for so many?
You know, I think it's really important to keep in mind the evolution of marriage as an institution. Initially, it was so much for convenience of the tribe or to keep peace among regions. When royalty in Europe would marry, it would be for all kinds of political reasons. That would be true for property. It really was not like the situation we're in now. Why get married? It's a completely different question than it was even 30 or 40 years ago, and certainly for all of evolutionary time before that. And one of the reasons that I think marriage is so challenging for so many is we don't have a new definition, a new context for marriage. And what I believe the purpose of marriage is it provides a context for individual growth and evolution. And of course, there are other purposes like being in love and enjoying life and having a partner and having a family, if that's what happens, and pooling financial resources and having a teammate and all kinds of things which are still possible with a kind of comfortable, flat, boring companionship. But if what we want is passion and fulfillment and all of the things that you said just a short while ago, it's like, I want to raise my hand. I want some of that. We need other tools than the ones that have been handed down, because the tools that have been handed down are suitable for marriage for another purpose of convenience and procreation. And when we want a marriage of political or material convenience and for the purposes of procreation, then the most common advice which is given throughout the world still pertains. And that advice is, if you want a great marriage, learn to compromise. Compromise is the key to a great marriage. And it is the key to a marriage which pools property and resources and leads to procreation of the tribe. But if what you want is juiciness and passion and fulfillment and someone who is interested in who you are and with whom you learn to reveal the whole truth of who you are, compromise will not get you that. Being uncompromising will. And I want to say one more thing, which is that when people hear the word uncompromising, they often think it means dominating, getting your way all of the time. And that is not at all what I mean by uncompromising. What I mean by uncompromising is this: when you compromise, you prioritize someone else's experience over your own, and you hold back to accommodate what you think their needs are. And being uncompromising means honoring your own experience just as much, if not a little bit more, than you honor your partner's, but you welcome both experiences. And when both of you have all of the needed information, what you want, who you are, what you're thinking about, then together you can make a genuinely collaborative decision about how to go forward.
But are these conversations then that we're actually having in our marriages, in our relationships? Are we talking about the person we are, the person we want to be, our own personal transformation? You talk about this in your book, which I have to say is a must read for all couples at every stage of their marriage. And you talk about this idea of a conscious partnership, don't you, where you're transforming together, but individually as well. I often sort of liken this to railway tracks. I've talked about this recently with a few people, and here we are, we're all on our own sort of railway tracks, taking our own journeys of personal transformation you just described, but every now and again we cross over and we come together. And
what a beautiful image.
And it's that idea that we can be in a marriage and be separate, but come together and still have everything that you've described. Is that realistic? Can you tell us more about this conscious partnership?
You know, it is realistic with an adjustment in understanding of what it means, because yes, it is unrealistic to have conversation focused on personal development and growth and evolution and spiritual insights all of the time. That is not a reality. I don't need to explain that any further. And when people have meaningful careers that take time and attention and family and a household and children of various ages, it's just completely unrealistic. In fact, there is this statistic in North America, I don't know that it pertains worldwide, it may not, I just don't know, which is that the average couple spends less than 4 minutes a day discussing anything other than logistics and children, and I would throw pets in there. So your question is very, very relevant, but I want to explain that I'm not just talking about esoteric communications about the truth of who we are. That sounds rather lofty. I'm also talking about how you say hello when your partner comes in the door at the end of the workday. What needs and desires, what truth of who you are is being camouflaged in that moment without being thought of in that way. You and I are having a conversation that inherently is conceptual, and so we're describing it this way, but I'm talking about that brief moment where your partner comes in and maybe you're in the middle of something and you don't want to be interrupted. Or maybe you've been waiting and he walks in the door and you want a little attention. You want a moment of feeling special. Or maybe he comes in the door and there's one child is crying and the other one needs a diaper change, and you just need him not to take a breath, not to go take a shower, but to just start being helpful. These are the places where who we are is also revealed. And that does take some time and attention for some of the ones I just said, maybe in the moment, but certainly the crying child and the diaper needing changing, that's not the time to sit down and have something to drink and carefully discuss it. No, you take action together, but the important thing is not to let a sense of unmet needs accumulate. But in sharing about this with your partner, it is not his or her job to meet your needs. It is your job to identify, how do you want to feel? Who do you want to be? How do you want to live? And share that and see what your partner's up for in terms of those transition moments at the end of the day. What I'm talking about in the creation of conscious partnership, yes, it pertains to lofty matters, but it pertains to the most mundane things, all the way down to the proverbial cap on the toothpaste.
Yeah. Gosh, there's such honesty in what you're saying, Alexandra. And I can't imagine there isn't anyone listening who doesn't resonate with what you just said. It's just taken me back to when my children were little. And I completely remember those evenings when I'd been home all day with crying baby. And as soon as that door opened, it was, here you are, honey, and handing over. And that for me was a moment of intimacy, need, whatever word you want to put on it. There was something that needed to happen in that moment within the relationship, within the marriage, that was quite symbolic. And, rock on many, many years. And it's interesting we're talking about this today because my husband and I were just having this very same conversation. And actually I said, you know what? There are times when I come home and the little dogs and puppies are more excited to see me. And this seems to happen, doesn't it? That we don't pay attention to what seems so small, that arrival home from a meeting, a trip, marking that as something quite symbolic in a relationship. But years down the line, it stops being noticed. And is that part of the difficulty, do you think, that we stop noticing what's important for each other?
Yes, I think because we're talking about the relationship we have with someone we live with for years and decades, it is very easy to start to take one another for granted, not in our essence, but in these very small moments, but they add up. And actually, transitions are one of the places where couples can get a little bit lazy. I don't say that judgmentally, but it's very easy to just move through transitions without giving them the attention that's due. If someone finishes school, or there are all kinds of rituals for major transitions, but we could actually look at marriage as a series of minute transitions, and how do we want to honor each of the changes. But I know you and I very much like practical, actionable things. So I want to go a little bit further with this. It's funny, excuse me, that you were reflecting on your marriage. I was thinking about mine earlier this morning because I have 4 children, but when my oldest 2 were maybe 1 and 3, I was mortified to find out that my husband, who's also a physician, would come home from a long shift. It might have been 12 hours, it might have been 30 hours. And he would sit in the driveway for a little while because he didn't know what he would come home to. And he needed to be kind of armored up emotionally for whatever I was going to hand him. That was years ago. We've been married for 25 years now. And what we now do, not 100% of the time, but it really doesn't need to be, is any time that we're interacting with a transition, it's really very easy and extremely efficient to just bring a little bit more attention. So for example, this morning when he headed off to work, I'm mostly working at home and he works in the hospital. It's easy to say nothing as he goes out the door. Honestly, the morning is a busy time. It's easy to say, bye, sweetheart, have a good day at work. And I do sometimes do that. But this morning I did what I aspire to do most often, which is when I gave him a kiss, it's not a peck. It's not that we're having some erotic makeout when he's on the way out the door. That actually would be incongruous. And he's a focused person. When he's headed out the door, he's headed out the door. It's not the time for something like that. But there's a way where I can just bring my full attention to that kiss on the lips, which, as I say, is not the most erotic, glorious thing, but it also isn't a kind of perfunctory peck. It is a real moment of connecting. And I think what is this amazing, it's like putting salt on food. You don't need a lot, but it makes all the difference to just bring more intentionality to each moment when you're actually interacting with one another. Because, as I enjoy saying, in a long-term committed relationship, anything which isn't sex is foreplay. And it either brings you a little closer together or a lot, or it brings you a little bit further apart. And so part of being uncompromising is having more and more of the moments that are shared bring you closer together. And in fact, another way that I say this is, especially for competent, high-achieving, smart women and men, but it's in a particular way with women, we need to remember to focus on the connection at least as much as we're focused on the content.
Connection and content. Yeah.
Because it's easy to just focus on the content and clarify the thing, make the plan, get on to the next thing, because life is full and asking so much of us. But in that, we inadvertently and mostly unconsciously turn away for an opportunity for connection, which takes no more time, really no more effort once we get in the habit. It's in a way a mindfulness practice, but a lot juicier and more on the go.
Yeah. And I see that it's that attentiveness, that being present, that mindfulness that you're just applying in that moment, which might last as long as a peck on the cheek, but there's something more there because you've been fully present for it. So that's so interesting. I know in, is it John Gottman's book where he talks about principles for making marriage work? He actually says that he can predict cases where marriages will succeed or not succeed with sort of 91% accuracy, I think is what he quotes. Do you think what you've just talked about, that attentiveness, is a predictor for whether a marriage has got long-lasting legs or not? Are there predictors that we should be looking out for?
It's a very interesting question. And let me be very clear. John Gottman has 40 years of research, and I do anecdotal personal research. I love asking questions and seeing what the answer is, but I don't have data like he does. And I wouldn't right off the bat say that doing this it could be a positive predictor. Let me just say that, because it still, in my view, really rests on whether it's genuine and authentic. And when we do anything because we should, or we let a role dictate how we interact with our partner, with our spouse, that is going in the direction of compromise for me. So one could put attention on how we say goodbye in the morning. And it can come from within, because I want to be more present and share who I am and enjoy the connection. I think that's a very positive predictor. It could be that we're doing it because that's what is supposed to happen to make a good marriage. And then it could look very similar, but inside there's still that hollowness. It's just transferring the numbness in a way. So I know what I'm saying is super nuanced, but what I'm really wanting to point to is it would be better to do less with enthusiasm and honesty than to do more for appearances, but inside it's not as engaging.
Yeah. for sure. So we've got attentiveness and presence as perhaps a key ingredient for
Yes.
making marriage work. What other ingredients would you say are pretty key?
One which I love to talk about because it is so simple and has such a beautiful return on any investment of time put in it is cultivating curiosity. If you think of the experience of being in love, it's filled with curiosity. Where is that scarf from? And what was your second grade teacher's name? And did you like vegetables when you were a child? And if you could be president of any country, which one would you like to rule? And it can be whimsical questions. It can be more personal, more sexual, more spiritual. The feeling of being in love is just permeated with this curiosity. Mm-hmm. And one of the beautiful things about marriage is that we develop companionship, familiarity, safety, and there's something really loving and fulfilling in knowing what your partner's answer would be to a particular question. But then we stop asking questions and we just marinate in the companionship. But when we bring that curiosity back, it's another variation on attention and presence because, excuse me, I don't have COVID, but I'm coming out of a cough and I was so excited to have this conversation. I apologize for that. So another element of attention and presence is really seeing who is this person and being curious and asking questions. And when I've spoken about this and people who've been together for 30 years, a woman will hear me talk and go home and ask her husband questions she hasn't asked ever or in a long time. And suddenly that evening, things are a lot juicier. It really is a profound way to build more connection, just to ask. And I guess I really want to add that when you ask a question, it's very important that you listen generously to the answer, that you appreciate that your spouse is sharing honestly, and don't get into judging it, because that will just mean less sharing in the future.
Yeah. Absolutely. The curiosity, I love that, but it has to be genuine, doesn't it? It's not a question just for a question. It's a question because you're longing to hear the answer and then build on that and build on that. There's got to be a bit of a yearning to really know, hasn't there, as well?
Yes.
Go on. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. And that's why the questions can be whimsical. They can be historical. You know, it's whatever is actually interesting.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask, do you think there's a gender difference here in perhaps men not wanting to answer questions and women wanting to ask the questions? Is there a bit of a risk of a bit of disconnect there if we're talking about curiosity through questioning? And what happens in a relationship when one person is more naturally open than another, or one is more probing than another? What happens there?
Well, there are a few things to consider, and there is a bit of a gender gap, but there's also what I think of as the culture in any given marriage. And if your marriage culture between the two of you does not include curiosity, when you hear this and then you turn to your partner and ask questions, you may not get real answers. They may not realize you're actually asking because it's just unfamiliar. And so in that situation, I highly recommend you just keep asking, and you really think of it as changing the culture of your marriage rather than drilling to get an answer from your spouse. And it's also important not to necessarily wait for your spouse to ask the questions. He or she may not catch on in that way, but you can go ahead and not be like, well, don't you want to know what no. Just reveal what your answer is. And in the process, you share who you are and your inviting your spouse to participate on that level. And the one other thing that I want to add is parity is really completely overrated in marriage. It's not necessary. It's not necessary for one person to have one kind of answer and then the other person to have the same kind of answer. Or maybe you ask one another different questions because you're genuinely interested in different things. All of that is interesting. And it doesn't need to be equal. And my experience with the couples that I coach is that men are actually very glad to share more, but it's a lot more tender than we think. And any good man who is married to a competent, successful woman, either he dominates her, or what is actually much more common is he has learned, no matter how successful and alpha he is out in the world, in the context of the marriage, he's learned to go with what she wants. He's doing a lot of compromising just naturally without even thinking about it. And often we women want communication to be in a certain way. We want helpfulness to be in a certain way. And it's my experience that the men who look disinterested, when their spouses make it safe enough, then they actually are authentically more interested than we could have imagined in advance. And there are ways in which some of the most important elements of cultivating curiosity are making it safe for our partner to give the real answers or to not know what his answer is. My husband, he's a Harvard graduate, he's a physician, he's highly competent, and he knows how to make very quick decisions in all kinds of circumstances. But there are things that I asked him that were simple about his preferences. And if I had been in a rush to get the answer, I never would have found out. Like, one of the most important things that I have learned is that successful men, when it comes to emotional questions, they need a lot more time than we typically give them. Like, it's amazing when I coach couples and I'm asking the question where I'll have a man say, that's a good question. I need to think about it. I'll get back to you. And I'll say, no, there's time.
And that is so important, isn't it? That the time and also the parity that you've just mentioned there, so that there isn't this sense of resentment that I'm always the one asking you how your day was, or I'm always the one coming to greet you, I'm always the one initiating sex. And then we develop this non-parity and the resentment around that. But appreciating what you said is that parity isn't the important thing. Who goes first is not the important thing, is it?
Absolutely. And maybe your contribution is to initiate the questions. Well, rather than wanting your spouse to initiate the questions too, maybe consider what their contribution is, which is different than yours, and you don't want to be making, but is very significant to the glue in your relationship.
Yeah.
And when you appreciate that, and you really see your partner for how they are loving you, there's a much higher chance that if you say, would you ask me some questions too? That they'll be willing to do it. But if you haven't seen their contribution and you're just asking for them to change and essentially giving a report card on their inadequacy, well, that's not very inspiring, to put it mildly.
And now, here is your lifestyle first prescription. Your 3 activating actions to take you from knowing to doing.
But look, let's get to that action stage. You and I, we both enjoy and need people to just take what we've talked about today and translate that into action, really. So have you got 3 things that couples listening today can do, those who want to make marriage work?
Absolutely. So 2 that I'm going to mention we've already talked about, and I'm just going to encapsulate them, and then I'll add a third. So the first is pay attention to the transitions in your marriage, whether it's the beginning of the day, the end of the day, getting up from the table, sitting down from the table, getting into bed. I mean, there's just a myriad of transitions, and look at one of those transitions which feels a little unsatisfying and think about what would make it satisfying and then go for it. So for me, it was really taking the time to give a meaningful, though quick, kiss where I felt the connection. And that has been beautiful in my marriage. And I think that will make a difference. That's one thing. The second is to really cultivate curiosity. You can pick a few questions. I'll just give some examples that are more whimsical, because you might, when you're listening, have something else you want to know that you haven't asked. But a few examples are, if you could have dinner with any celebrity, alive or dead, who would it be and what would you ask? The one that I mentioned earlier, if you could be president of any country, which country would it be and what policy would you implement? And maybe something more personal, like what has been the most gratifying part of this past week for you? So pay attention to the transitions and make one of them more delicious and nourishing. Cultivate curiosity. And then the third thing is an underpinning of everything we've talked about, although we haven't talked about it yet. And that is to take some time to think about what you want. Because one of the most challenging issues is that we don't feel satisfied unless we have what we want, but we haven't taken the time to actually identify what that is. And it is much easier to complain or express dissatisfaction, but in every complaint is hidden a beautiful desire. And to really pivot from the dissatisfaction or the general kind of numbness that can happen in a relationship, and instead direct your attention to identifying a desire, something you'd like. And the more simple and more specific it can be, simple, I don't mean that it has to be a simple desire like what you want for dinner. It can be as grand or as contained as you wish, but to be able to express it simply and specifically, because then you have a chance of making it happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexandra. Just those three questions, those three approaches, I have a feeling that they're very profound and very transformative and have a ripple effect with each other as well. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. And as I said, your book as well is well worth read for anybody who hasn't picked it up yet. So fantastic. And where can listeners seek you out or find out more about your work and your concepts and your approach?
All of it is found on my website, alexandrastockwell.com. And from there, you can find my book. It's also available on Amazon and Audible throughout the world. I have a free Facebook group, my podcast. I have many different things, as well as programs and private coaching. And the best place to go is alexandrastockwell.com.
Wonderful. Thank you. I will share that link to your website for you. Absolutely. And thank you so much. It's been a fabulous conversation. But really, we do need to draw to a close. So that simply leaves me to wish everybody listening a happy, healthy day.
Thanks for joining us on the Lifestyle First podcast, making self-care as easy as 1, 2, 3. Don't forget to subscribe and share. And we'd love it if you'd be kind enough to leave a review. To learn more or to arrange a consultation, please visit www.dralkapatel.com. See you next time.